And I'd like to introduce Phyllis Saarinen, who is pitch hitting today as facilitator. So welcome, Phyllis. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I told Sheila Dickinson that I would be honored to introduce Professor Mary Ann Eaverly, a popular teacher in the classics department at UF and also an affiliate faculty member of art history. We're privileged to be able to enjoy and learn about Greek and Roman mythology during her next 5 presentations in this program. Professor Eaverly also has a very good presentation on Pompeii that we might talk her into giving sometime. She teaches 3 courses at UF, including Introduction to Classical Archaeology and also Greek mythology. She has excavated in the Eastern Mediterranean as well as Spain and has been active for many years in the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Interestingly, she's written extensively on the convergence of ancient mythological and archaeological imagery with modern poetry, which sounds challenging to me. I'd like to know more about that. Her love of archaeology and the study of ancient cultures was inspired by her great-grandfather, a 1920s era classics professor at a now closed historically Black college. She took her PhD in classical art and archaeology from the University of Michigan. I had the pleasure of working with Mary Ann when she served as president of the Gainesville Society of Archaeological Institute of America. Please welcome Dr. Mary Ann Eaverly.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Phyllis. Good to see you again. And I've been here before, and I'm glad to be here again because you are a great audience. Because when I say things like Mussolini, I don't have to explain there was a war and then the United States, whereas, let's face it, in my classroom today, I have to do things like that. So it's always a pleasure to speak at OCAMIC. Okay, ready to go. All right, today's class is the first in our myth series, and as the first, it's going to be introductory. I'm going to set the historical stage and talk about a little bit about the pantheon of Greek gods and goddesses. So for some of you, you may sit here this first class and think, I knew that, but that's good. You knew that, but there'll be some things hopefully that you won't know, and I just want everybody to be in the same level. So we'll start out with some basics today. Okay, so first basic, I'm in the classics department. I teach classical archaeology, classical mythology, and when we say classical, we mean Greek and Roman. But when we say Greek and Roman, we're not just talking about Greece and Rome, we're talking about the entire greater Mediterranean basin, because the Roman Empire included all of the things you see on this map. So we really have to talk about the greater Mediterranean basin. But we also want to talk about Greece. And when we talk about Greece in antiquity, it's not the Greece of the modern world. It is not a unified country. We think of Greece as a country. In antiquity, Greece was a series of independent city-states. They thought of themselves as Greeks. They had common religion, common mythology. But if you asked somebody what they were, they'd say, I'm an Athenian, I'm a Spartan. And their cities ruled themselves. That is, Athens had its own system of government and ruled its own territory. Sparta had its own system of government, ruled its own territory. So all those little dots are independent units who actually would fight against each other on many occasions. So it's never a unified country, but it's a unity of religious beliefs, a unity of language, but not a political entity in antiquity. You can curl this, okay. All right, now. In order to understand Greek mythology, we also need to understand the landscape, the geography, the topography that this mythology developed from. So we have to think of a very mountainous area. These individual cities are really often separated from each other by mountains, so that also encourages independent growth. In these pockets, there can be fertile land. You see my my students call this my Mediterranean sheep photo. I use it a lot for different things, but there are pockets of fertile land, but not a lot of fertile land. Greece is not a place where you can just plant seeds and stuff grows. You have to work hard to get food from this land, and that's going to influence people's beliefs. And then something else that we tend to take for granted, a consistent water supply. You see this beautiful river in the slide. These kinds of rivers were seasonal in Greece. So water was an important thing. And so sources of water, springs, for example, become associated with divinities because these are special and important areas. So this is a land that, while beautiful, is a harsh place to live. And this is going to influence people's ideas about the gods and about life. Okay. Also, we have to take into consideration that Greece is not by itself in its developing periods. We have the older civilizations of Egypt to the south and what we call the Near East, Persia, Assyria, all of that civilization. And these areas have their own beliefs, their own stories, their own art, which very much influences Greece, especially in some of the formative periods in Greek history. So we're not just looking at Greece and Rome. Now, we have to go back in history to get to the root of some of these stories. And so we're going all the way back to what archaeologists call the early Middle Bronze Age, 3000 to about 1600 BC. And where we want to go first is to the island of Crete, which you see in the bottom part of this slide. The civilization that grew up in that area and the subsequent civilization that grew up on the mainland were both discovered in the 19th century by these two men on, all right, I never get this right. On the right is Arthur Evans, who's a British scholar. On the left is Heinrich Schliemann, who was a German businessman. So these two men couldn't be more opposite, but they ended up being the people who found the earliest civilizations that are associated with Greece. The earlier civilization was found by Evans, and it was actually found after the later civilization, which was found by Schliemann. So we're going to have to look at what Evans found first, but just keep in mind that he actually found it after Schliemann found what he found. So what did Evans find? He found what he called Minoan civilization. And why did he call it Minoan civilization? Because he was steeped in Greek mythology, right? He's a British scholar. And Greek mythology tells us that on Crete, there was a king named Minos. Okay, so Evans goes into this saying, okay, I'm at Crete. This is the civilization of Minos. And so to this day, we call it Minoan civilization. What he found was a building complex, what he called a palace at a site called Knossos. He called it a palace because, mythologically speaking, King Minos lived at Knossos. If you got a king, any building you find there has to be a palace. A lot of assumptions packed onto that, which archaeologists have been unpacking over the years, because all the things that a palace implies, right? You don't just have a king, got to have a queen, maybe a few princesses, they live there, that's their home. All those things were put in this one word, and they may not necessarily apply to this building. But you're looking at some of the things he found. You see those large jars, those were storage jars. They could hold grain, they could hold oil, and right away, there are way more of those than any one family could ever use. So you have to back away from this is the house of the king and queen only. You see some of the architecture, it was built out of wood and stone. Wood was put vertically in it. I don't know if anyone here is an architect or an engineer, but that wood allowed the buildings to withstand earthquakes. They were more flexible in earthquakes. You see the thing that looks like a horn that's sitting on the top. All right, Evans looked at that and he said, that was the sacred horn. Archaeologists always call it the sacred something if they don't know what it is. These are the sacred horns of consecration. All right, we now know that this is probably a symbol taken from the Egyptian hieroglyph for mountain. That is, the Minoans oriented their these palace complexes towards mountains, and so this is not horns, but I mean, Evans was working in the 1900s. He's using the ideas that he has, so we can't make fun of him, but he put a lot into it that maybe wasn't there. He also reconstructed the palace, which is good and bad. If you reconstruct something, any mistakes you make end up becoming more permanent than they should have been. On the other hand, I've talked to people who've been to some of the other Minoan palaces, and they say, but there's nothing there. Of course, to an archaeologist, there's a lot there, but I get the point. So if you want more of a Minoan palace experience, you go to Knossos, but it's not entirely accurate. Okay? But the plan is accurate, and the plan reveals a building that has many parts organized around an open central courtyard. There are areas that were definitely for storage, but again, way more capacity than for a king and queen. There are areas that have religious objects found. Again, we think they're religious objects. Religious objects found, workshops. So not just a place for people to live. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind when we look at this, because I'm going to bring this up later, is look at the plan. This is a very maze-like plan. There is no direct entrance into any room, and there's an open central courtyard. So just keep that in mind. We will come back to that later. Also, it's a place full of bull images. We have this painting on the wall of bull jumping. This is something that actually is still done in modern times in some parts of the world. But we're not entirely sure why they did this. Was it sport? Was it religion? Certainly in later Greek times, the bull is a powerful animal and very much associated with religion. So maybe, And you see that beautiful bull's head on the side, and you think, oh, a statue of a bull. No, that was actually a drinking vessel. And you drank wine out of the neck of the bull. Why would you do that? Well, if you sacrifice a bull, you would have its bloody head, right? So this is a stone version of its bloody head, and the wine, the red wine, you would be drinking out of the stump of the head. So a lot of bull imagery in this place. Whoops, I want to go back and say one thing. Now, I tell you, I don't know about this. I don't know what this is. I can't be sure. Evans calls it the Palace of Knossos. How come I don't know? Why don't I know? Because we don't have any writing from these people. Well, I take that back. We have writing, but we can't read it. So that's we know they could write, but we can't read it. So there's nothing for us. There's no welcome to Palace of Minos. No, so that's the problem. Now, this is the early civilization on Crete. Most of the myths that we're going to deal with, a lot of them have to do with the story of the Trojan War. And the Trojan War is a story that Schliemann, the other person who helps find the early civilization, Schliemann was immersed in the stories of the Trojan War. In fact, and my students find this impossible to believe, he taught himself Greek and Latin so he could read the original things. And he believed that the Trojan War, the war between the Greeks and Troy, was something that had happened. And he said, I am going to go and find Troy. And when he said this was the equivalent to my saying, you know, I really believe that Ariel, the little mermaid, lived under the sea, and I will find her palace. I mean, it was almost that fanciful. People didn't, you know, these are great stories, but there's no people associated with these stories, no artifacts that we can find. But in fact, he went to modern day Turkey and found Troy. Right. So he did that. You see the excavation in the center. All the other stuff is, you know, there's a phony wooden horse. And that movie, I just have to say, don't see that movie unless you get it for free and they provide snacks. Because that movie is not realistic as far as anything to do with the Trojan War story. So anyway, there's the excavation in the center that actually was excavated. Some of you may know that Schliemann made some things up and did a few things that weren't quite right, but still, he did uncover this Troy. So he said, I found Troy. All right, well, what about the Greek side of the story? The Greeks left from the city of Mycenae with the leader of the city of Mycenae as their leader. They left from Greece and they went to Troy. So if I found Troy, I ought to be able to find Mycenae. I ought to be able to find the Greek city. And so he found Troy, and then he went to Mycenae on the mainland, and he found Mycenae. He found a city, a Bronze Age city. This is the main entrance gate to the city. You get a sense of the size. I tell my students there are people who travel the world just to be scales in pictures. And I actually know this scale because I took this picture, but she's about 5 feet tall, so you can get a sense. Massive defensive walls at Mycenae, which fits with, right, Trojan War story. These people are warriors. They have incredibly large defensive systems. So this is the main gate at Mycenae. You're inside looking out, and then if you were approaching, you would see that emblem, which looks like 2 felines. The heads are gone, but they would have been looking right at you, telling you, this is a powerful place. Don't mess with us, basically, is what they're saying. Now, he also found at Mycenae graves, very wealthy graves. They had gold death masks. And he looked at this gold death mask and he said, remember, he's read his Iliad and his Odyssey. He's steeped in Greek mythology. He looks at this death mask and he says, I am looking at the face of Agamemnon, leader of the Greeks. However, this was also one of the death masks. I call it Uncle Fester from the Addams family. Why couldn't Uncle Fester be Agamemnon, leader of the Greeks? The point is that none of these people are probably actually Agamemnon. This is a Bronze Age civilization. This is a civilization that takes place at the time when we think whatever later became known as the Trojan War happened. But that doesn't mean that any of these people can actually be firmly tied down as any of the mythological people. What's wrong with Fester? Now, they wrote too. And the wonderful thing is, we can read their writing. Evans collected some of the tablets at Knossos because these Mycenaeans actually took over the Minoan civilization. So he found these tablets there, but it took 2 other people to be able to translate it. One who's only recently been recognized was a woman named Alice Kober, who was a professor at Hunter College, who realized that how you translate something, and this is how most people do things, you look for patterns, right? And so she wrote down symbols and patterns, and all she had to work with, it was during the war, where she had cigarette wrappers that she would write things on and filed endless cases. And so she was able to identify all of these patterns. But she died before the Great Revelation, which was another amateur, man named Michael Ventris, who, when he was looking at the patterns that she had identified, he began to realize that what he was seeing was a way of writing Greek. And so he announced to the world in a BBC broadcast that he had translated this language, which we call Linear B. The Minoan language that we can't read, we call Linear A. This one we call Linear B. So you say, hooray, if we can read it, it must tell us everything. They didn't use it for letter writing or literature or poetry. They used it for record keeping. And so we have tablets with 4 sheep, 12 maidens, X amount of wool, but not what anybody thought. So I always tell my students, it's as if you had the register tapes from Publix. That's what you had for our civilization. And you saw on there bubble bath, 5-pound bag of M&Ms, 6 magazines. But you don't get the story that someone just broke up with someone and is in the tub eating M&Ms, reading magazines. Right? Well, this is how I solve my problems. I don't know how you solve your problems. But the point is you don't get the backstory. We learn a lot. We learn about social organization. We learn that there was a ruler. We learn about different social classes. We learn about commodities that are traded. So we do learn a lot of things. We even learned something that was very surprising, which is the names of the Greek gods and goddesses, the ones that we're used to, they're there, and in particular, one that no one expected to be there, the god Dionysus, the god of wine. His mythology has him traveling all over the world until he finally is accepted in Greece. And so the standard wisdom was, he's a latecomer to the Greek pantheon, but he's right there in the Bronze Age. His name is there. Okay, so that's what we know. And if there was a Trojan War, and it's a big if, but whatever happened, if something happened that was told over and over again through the ages, this is the period when it happened. It may not be the exact story, of course, that we have now, but this is the period when something happened. Now we move on. There's a real gap between the Bronze Age and the next period when people really start to get themselves together. The Bronze Age civilization collapses. Something bad happens in the greater Mediterranean basin. We hear about it from the Egyptians, because we can read Egyptian writing and they write things other than lists. And Pharaoh says, ugh, terrible times. People are invading, but I, Pharaoh, was able to, save Egypt. But he wasn't able to save the rest of the world. And so things collapse, and there's a long period that archaeologists used to call the Dark Ages, which makes it sound like the sun never came up and nothing. But it was a period that was dark because we had no writing of any kind, and the material culture was at a very low level. If you think about it, if you don't have palaces anymore, you don't need to have gold death masks for rulers, you don't need big construction, you don't need a lot of stuff. So people are living at a fairly low level during this period, and it's hard for us to figure out what's going on. What's also intriguing for us is how much of what happened in that Bronze Age transferred across to this later period. What did people remember? And in terms of remember, I don't mean there would be anybody you could talk to about the Bronze Age who was still alive, but oral traditions, people telling stories about the Trojan War, these other kinds of things. Also, while these palaces were ruined, some of the tombs weren't, some of the other things were visible. What sense did the later Greeks make of them? We know that when they saw things like Mycenae with the great big gate, they said, this was made by one-eyed giants, by the Cyclops, because they couldn't imagine humans having made it. And archaeologists call it Cyclopean masonry, because it's so big. So that's a big thing. But finally, around 800, you can see there, writing. So now we're in business. We have some sense of what people were thinking, not just what their commodities were. And this is a period when we get the important, almost we'd call them texts for myth, right? The Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, Homer's poetry was recited and then written down. It wasn't originally written and then read. So there's an oral tradition that went on and on and on, and Homer is writing it down. And it's interesting that in the Iliad and the Odyssey, that Homer's writing in this archaic period, much of what goes on is just what goes on in his own period. The weaponry, for example, is iron and things of his period. But every now and then, there is something that is verifiably Bronze Age. So, for example, he talks about the warriors wearing boar's tusk helmets. Nobody in his age wore a boar's tusk helmet. But if you look at wall paintings from the Bronze Age, the warriors have on boar's tusk helmets, and we've even excavated tombs from this period where there are boar's tusk helmets. So there's a memory that continues down. Hesiod is our other writer. These are supposedly portraits of them, but they're much later portraits. We have no images of what they look like actually, but this is what they ought to have looked like, right? And Hesiod is our other source. He writes this very long poem that is how the universe came to be the way it is, where the gods came from. That's something we're going to explore in our next class, how the universe was created. And now we get vase painting and temples made out of stone, and all of it with mythological decoration. Especially in Athens, the Athenians love to decorate their pottery with themes from Greek mythology. So if the vase that you're seeing here, it's kind of hard to make out, but it's actually the Gorgon sisters chasing Perseus, who killed their sister Medusa. The pediment that we see from the temple, that's another example of Medusa. So a lot of imagery now we're getting in addition to having writing. These things are very popular subjects for art and architecture. We're also getting stone temples, and temples in the ancient world are not what you might expect. They're not places where people go inside and worship. The purpose of a temple is to hold the statue of the god or goddess. The religious aspect goes on outside in front. It's actually the sacrifice that takes place. Now, I want you to think a minute. Remember I told you, remember that plan of the palace of Minos at Knossos. And now I'm going to give you an example of how a distant memory might inform a myth, right? You may be familiar with the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, but basically there is a monster, half man, half bull, that lives in a maze at Knossos. Now I'm talking about the myth. And the hero, the Athenian hero Theseus, has to go there and kill this half man, half bull. Right, well, now think about it. How could we get from the Bronze Age to this? Think about it. Think about the plan of Knossos. Isn't it like a maze? Doesn't it have an open courtyard in the center where a bull man could live in the center of a maze? And doesn't Knossos have a lot of bull imagery? So what I'm saying is that no, the palace at Knossos was not used to hold a minotaur. We have to face it. There's no such thing as a half man, half bull. Even in antiquity, they had to have a special, in the myth, they had to have a special craftsman come and make a cow suit so the woman could mate with the bull. So we know that that wasn't what actually happened. But think about that. So this is then this myth is a distant memory of a place that was like a maze, a place that was full of bull imagery, a place that's no longer understood in its original function, but now becomes the catalyst for this story. So that's how these stories could be passed from the Bronze Age through that Dark Age period down to the period when we have literature. Next period, if you knew anything about the Greek world, this is the one everybody knows about, right? The classical period. This is the one that's held up as the golden age. This is 5th century Athens, the Parthenon, the Acropolis. This is considered really the high point of Greek civilization. The Parthenon itself is a treasure trove of mythological scenes too, because the Greeks, again, they decorated their temples. The Parthenon itself has scenes about their goddess Athena. It has scenes that relate to their golden moment for them, which was their victory over the Persians too. So mythology everywhere. And also, Athens in the 5th century is where all of these great playwrights come together. People like Sophocles and Euripides. And what do they use as the basis of their plays? Mythology. So we get a lot of our Greek myths from these plays as well. Antigone, Oedipus, these are all people you've probably heard of. And these plays were performed in Athens in the 5th century BC. Time marches on as we move through history. And remember, there were all little Greek city states. Well, they all ended up fighting against each other and had a disastrous war. And Philip of Macedon, who had a kingdom in the north, looked down and said, "Isn't that sweet? Look at them all fighting with each other. This would be a good time for me to expand my territory." And basically, he played them against each other. He conquered this one, he allied with that one, and he got control of Greece. But Philip was assassinated, leaving everything to his son Alexander. And Philip had bigger plans than Greece. He wanted Egypt and the whole Persian Empire. And so his son Alexander the Great, seen here in a Roman mosaic, did it. He conquered all of that. But he liked conquering things. And there's a difference between conquering things and ruling things. He didn't really have a plan. He just wanted to keep going, see more of the world. But his troops finally said, "We would like to go home now. No more." Sorry, shorter. And he died young. And when he died, as he was dying, and if you're a famous person and you're dying, you have to have great last words, right? And he did. They said, "Alexander, all this territory we've conquered, in Mobile, or to whom does it belong? Which one of us? We're your generals. Which one of us are you leaving your kingdom to?" He had a son, but the son was an infant, so that wasn't going to work. "Which one of us will get it?" And he looked at them and he said, "My kingdom goes to the strongest," and died. Okay. Well, there wasn't anybody who was the strongest, but there were strong guys. So what you see is they carved it up into different territories. Egypt was ruled by one. The old Persian Empire was ruled by another. Greece was ruled by other. You may know the final descendant of one of Alexander's generals in Egypt. That is Cleopatra. Her family line comes from one of Alexander's generals. The point of this, though, is there's much broader squashes of territory that are Greek influence now, right? These Macedonians, they mix Greek culture with Egypt, Greek culture with Persia, Greek culture all over the place. And so you have a much more international world and a much more Greek world. So we call it Hellenistic. It's Greek-like because it's Greek-Egyptian, it's Greek-Persian. Alexander founded many Alexandrias. Everywhere he went, he set up an Alexandria. But the most famous one is the one in Egypt, which had its library. And in that library, which we do not have today, which is all lost, were all kinds of manuscripts of things. So a rich source of mythological treasures. And in fact, ancient scholars would go research things at the library in Alexandria. So for example, one of the topics was apparently, how many affairs did the Greek god Zeus have? We'll talk about that later. But okay. And then we have the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire eventually takes over everything that was the Hellenistic world and more. Okay, so we have the Roman Empire, which has a long stretch of time, but also a contribution to mythology. Because some of our best versions of what we might call Greek myths come from Roman writers. So for example, the writer Ovid writes the Metamorphoses, which details many, many Greek myths. This one is the story of Apollo and Daphne. Apollo is in love with Daphne, but you know, Cupid has two kinds of arrows. One is the love arrow, But I always tell my students this should be a great comfort to you. The other is the repulsion arrow. So sometimes you may be hit with the love arrow, but the object of your affection is hit by the repulsion arrow, and there's just nothing you can do about that. So he loved Daphne, and she was repulsed, and so she begged her father, who was a river god, to help her get away from this situation. So she was transformed into a tree, so that you see that going on. This is a Renaissance version of that. But she's being transformed into a laurel tree. And Apollo said, oh, well, said, if you're not going to be my woman, which it's clear, you're a tree now. If you're not going to be my woman, you'll be my tree. And so the laurel is forever associated with Apollo. But again, the best versions of some of these myths we get from Roman writers. And then, of course, the Greeks had the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Epic poems about Greece. The Romans, they aren't in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the Roman writer Virgil managed to take the Trojan side and have the Trojan side be the ancestors of the Romans. And so he writes a national epic for the Romans. The Greeks had the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Romans still read those, but now the Romans have the Aeneid. So a lot of what we might think of as, classical mythology isn't just Greek, it's also coming from the Roman world. Now, I want to talk about the gods now. Okay, so the nature of the gods. In the Greek world, the gods are human in shape and behavior. This was not the case in the Roman world. The Romans had simply spirits at first. So they had the spirits of things like wheat fungus. What kind of story are you going to have about wheat fungus? It came and it went. When the Romans meet the Greeks and they see this rich pantheon of stories, because the Greek gods are human in behavior too. And when the Romans see this, they begin to equate their spirits with Greek gods. And so that's why many of our Greek gods and goddesses have a Greek name and a Roman name. The Roman name was originally a Roman spirit, something without a body, and then they meet the Greeks and they think, okay, well, yeah, we have somebody who controls the sky. He's a spirit, but he could be Zeus. Okay, our Jupiter spirit is now Zeus. So that's how that works. So they are human in shape and behavior, and not the highest standards of human behavior always, right? Humans don't always behave well. The gods do not always behave well. They can be wounded and they can feel pain, but they heal right away. They don't have blood. They have something called ichor, which is a divine fluid. They don't eat. They eat ambrosia. When I was a child, there was some kind of salad made with coconut, and nothing to do with the Roman ambrosia. I don't know why. And although they are human formed, they are taller, they are faster, and they are more beautiful than humans. They never grow old, ever, and they are immortal. Now, these two things are not the same, right? We'll see that sometimes humans forget. This is important. If a genie comes to you and grants you a wish, the human impulse is to say, I want to be immortal. But if you forget to stay youthful for the whole time, then we have stories of people who just wasted away finally because they were immortal, but they kept growing older and older. The gods do not grow old. There are differences in the maturity, the ages of the gods. For example, Zeus is a mature man. Apollo is a younger man, but they don't ever grow old and they cannot die. Their relationship with humans. They are not benevolent spirits that love and care about human beings. What they want from human beings is to be worshipped, right? That's basically what they want. And they can get bored and mess around with human beings. Remember, we go back to the geography that we talked about. This is an uncertain place, right? You can't always get a good crop. You can't always find water. And that plays into this idea that the gods, you can't really trust them. They can do things to you. You can offend them in ways you have no idea, and then bad things happen. Humans try really hard to stay on the good side of gods by religious practices, right? You give them gifts, you make offerings to them, you sacrifice to them. But you can be the most devoted follower of a particular god or goddess, and if another god or goddess doesn't like you, your god or goddess that you're devoted to is going to say, okay, fine, whatever you want to do, I don't mind. So it's a very uncertain group. They do not care for human beings. Religion, we talked about the temple as being the house for the statue of the god or goddess. The god or goddess is worshipped through primarily animal sacrifice at the altar outside the temple. What kind of animals? Sheep, bulls are very important sacrifices. Okay. Now, the sacrifice, because of a mythological story, this sacrifice is divided equally between humans and the gods. Humans get the meat, the gods get the smoke. And everybody's happy with this division. It has a mythological basis, as we will see. You give them offerings. Votive offerings are gifts, statues, vases, jewelry, whatever you want to give them. The gods like shiny, they like dazzling, they like beautiful things. Or you can pour them a liquid gift, an offering which is called a libation. You can pour oil or wine as an offering to the god. So what you see here is people on this vase, they're making a libation to an image of a god. Now, there are many, many spirits in the ancient Greek world that have human form. Every river has a river god. Every spring has a divinity. Trees have. But there are also the 12 main gods, the Olympians. Those are the main gods, but keep in mind that there are nymphs in the ocean and tree spirits, and everywhere there's something you have to worry about. But the 12 Olympians, all except for Hades, lived on Mount Olympus. Hades is the ruler of the underworld, so he's got to live in the underworld. But these are the biggies. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Aphrodite, plus 6 children of Zeus and Hera, 1 maybe of Hera alone, and a bunch of Zeus and people that aren't Hera, who is his wife. These things happen. Okay. This is Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece. This is where the gods supposedly lived. My students are always saying, well, didn't people just like climb up there and see that there wasn't anything there? Well, why would you do that, right? The gods live on Mount Olympus. Why would you, a human, want to climb up there to call attention to yourself from the gods? That nobody was going to go climb Mount Olympus with a spirit of, I shall prove that there are no gods. That didn't cross anybody's mind. So let's look at them. Zeus and his brothers, and we're going to talk about where they all came from next time. But Zeus and his brothers, the first one we're going to look at is Poseidon, the lord of the deep, the lord of the sea. The Romans equated to their sea god Neptune. He's also associated with earthquakes and storms, and also with horses. We don't understand all of these associations. Some of them may be from the fact that he was originally a god from people that were more horse-related people that was actually adopted by the Greeks. We don't exactly know why that is, but this is the case. In fact, he is the father of the first horse. Don't worry about it. Not going to worry about, you get really confused if you try to worry about anatomically things working in Greek mythology. And there he is. His weapon is the trident, the pitchfork. He, like Zeus, is a mature man because he wears a beard, but a mature man in the prime of life. Okay, a man who works out. He's got a six-pack. And that's what Hollywood always gets wrong, right? Hollywood always wants the gods like Zeus to be like the father figure and older. Not in the Greek mind. They were young, fit. The only thing that marks them as mature is the fact that they have a beard. And you can see Poseidon with his trident that the male gods were not exactly faithful. He's running after someone in this phase, and definitely that's not his wife. Okay. Hades, the other brother, the brothers drew lots as to which areas they would control. Poseidon got to see Zeus was always going to be the chief god. He has the sky. Hades gets the underworld. That's the worst real estate, the underworld. The Greeks believed, and the Romans too, that after you died, all you became was a gray shadow. And you went to the underworld with all of the other gray shadows. That was it. It didn't matter if you were a good person or a bad person. Everybody goes to the same place and leads the same gray existence in afterlife. Okay. So Hades rules over this area with his wife Persephone and the three-headed dog Cerberus. The three-headed dog, which you may know from Harry Potter, they have him as Fluffy, but the three-headed dog is not there to keep people out, because people aren't really just like, hey, I want to get to the underworld. No, he's there to keep people in. Okay, so it's a gloomy place. But Hades too, handsome, prime of life, bearded. Okay, Zeus, king of the gods, here he is holding, and you say, what is he holding? That's what the Greeks thought a thunderbolt looked like. That's just, he's king of the gods, chief god, again, mature because of the beard, but in the prime of life. And these are the things that he is in charge of. He's the overseer of everything that happens on earth. He's the most powerful of the gods. But again, remember I said the Greek and Roman gods do things that people do. So he had many, many affairs. But that's okay because he's a force of sexual generation in the universe. So he has to do these things, right? Okay, this is a brief chart of the affairs. Some with goddesses, some with mortals. Some result in gods and goddesses, some result in heroes. Any encounter that a god, any sexual encounter that a god or goddess has will result in a pregnancy because they are fertility, right? So, yeah. Okay, so that's just a brief chart. Remember, in the Hellenistic period, they came up with 300. Ares is one of his children. Ares is the god of war, and you might think the god of war is very powerful. The god of war is very powerful in the Roman world. Mars, one of the chief gods of the Roman state. But in the Greek world, not so much, because he's the god of what we call the bad aspects of war, bloodlust, killing, those kinds of things. He has very few myths associated with him, very few temples. And also, he's a bully and he's a coward. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, he's shown as somebody who doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't even know which side is which in the Trojan War. He's not bright, okay? And he's a coward. He gets wounded, and remember, they can feel pain and suffer, but they heal. And he goes back to Mount Olympus. He's been wounded in the Trojan War because the gods fight as well. And he complains, and his father, Zeus, you would expect his father to say, oh, that's okay. So his father says, I can't stand you. You whine all the time. Go away. So he's not a biggie for the Greeks, although he's a huge god for the Romans. So you see the difference. On the right is Ares sort of sitting around with the weapons, not doing much. On the left is Mars. Okay, it's a real difference. Hephaestus, Roman Vulcan, the blacksmith god, he is the only one of the gods who's not perfect. He's lame. He has a limp. Okay? And it's very interesting. He's the god who has a limp, and he's the god of manual crafts and metalworking and fire and creation. And many years ago, I went to the Smithsonian, and they had an exhibit on the last person who made authentic Japanese baskets. And you're saying, well, what does this have to do? Well, my myth mind doesn't turn off. And I listened to this man talk, and he said the reason why he became such a good basket weaver was because he was lame. So he couldn't do the agricultural things, he couldn't do the warfare things, but he could do the craft things. And that rang a bell with me. I thought, okay, Hephaestus is lame, so he can't do some of these other things, but he can do all of this technical stuff. He's also the husband of Aphrodite, goddess of love and sex and beauty. And he's not perfect, and he's very smart, and she's very physical and not really interested in him. So she ends up having an affair with Mr. No Brain but a lot of brawn, Ares. Here's Hephaestus. You can see him in his workshop, and you see him in another story where he's got his fire tongs. That's how you recognize him. Another story where he sent a bad present to his mother because he was angry at her, and she was imprisoned in this beautiful chair he had made for her. She couldn't get out. She was screaming and carrying on. All the gods tried to get him to let her out. He wouldn't do it, but not to worry. One of the gods was extremely persuasive and got him to go back and release his mother, and that was, of course, Dionysus, god of wine. He can persuade people to do many things. Hermes, Mercury, he was one of the most complex of all of the gods because he's associated with the fertility of the flocks, but also with anything that involves risk, travel, being a messenger. These little Greek city-states, remember, they're always fighting with each other. So if you want to talk from one to the other, you have to send a messenger. And the messenger has to have a special insignia so that nobody kills him on the road when he's trying to deliver his message. And then you notice that's this interesting juxtaposition. He's the god of liars, thieves, businessmen, gamblers, and orators. Orators, people who give speeches. Why is he associated with them? Because orators are trying to convince you of something, right? And sometimes they're not telling the truth. I won't say anything about businessmen. This is what he looks like. He can sometimes be a mature bearded figure. He can sometimes be young. He has winged shoes, and he carries the rod of the messenger. The pedissos is his hat, his traveler's hat. But he can also be worshipped as this rather unusual for us looking thing, the stone heap. This is a type of statue called a herm. It's a head of Hermes with a pillar with male sexual organ on it. And these were set up all over the place in the ancient world. They marked crossroads, they marked boundaries. And on the eve of one of Athens' most disastrous military expeditions, someone went through the city and cut off all of the male sexual organs from these statues. It's called the mutilation of the Herms. We don't know who did it, but the expedition was a disaster. Apollo is one of the younger looking male gods. He's a god of music, of poetry, of youthful male beauty. Okay. Prophecy as well. The sun, although he's not officially the one who pulls the sun across the sky, but he's associated with light and sun and manly beauty, sometimes called the far darter because he's also an archer. Because he's an archer, he brings plague. We're used to plague at this point in our lives, but the Greeks explain plague as Apollo is shooting arrows. And you know how the world works. Some people get sick and some people don't, and there's no real explanation for it, right? The person that drinks carrot juice every day and works out, they get sick. The person who drinks, a fifth of scotch every day and eats French fries doesn't get sick. Well, the reason is because Apollo randomly shoots these arrows of disease, and if you get hit, you get hit. But conversely, he can also heal you. Dionysus, god of wine, but also male fertility, any kind of liquid life force. Okay. Drama. You say, how can it be associated with drama? All those plays were put on in honor of Dionysus at the festival of Dionysus. Drama causes something the Greeks called ecstasis, our word ecstasy, but in the Greek word it means stepping outside of yourself. So think about it. When you watch a play, the actors are not themselves, but you are not yourself either, because you are accepting a world that doesn't exist, right? You are saying what's going on the stage is true. And there he is. This is my favorite picture of him because he's wearing his grape suit. And he carries a drinking cup. He can be either young or old, just depending on the situation. Not old, but young or mature. Some of these gods have two. Females, usually considered aspects of fertility. Hera, goddess of marriage. And who is she married to? Zeus. So she's got her work cut out for her, right? She's constantly policing that marriage. And you see she's not exactly successful at keeping him from having affairs. Demeter, agriculture. Hestia, she says, I want to just sit at home by the fire. I don't want to get married. I don't want to do any of that stuff. Okay, fine. So those are sisters of Zeus. Then we have Aphrodite, goddess of love and sex. There are different versions of how she comes to be. We'll talk about the most interesting one next time. Hera is Zeus's sister and wife. And you say, well, didn't they have incest rules in ancient Greece? Yes, they did for mortals. But let's face it, if you're a god or goddess, who are you going to hang with, right? You have to be with other gods and goddesses. So she is Zeus's sister, wife. She's in charge of marriage. And they said she's really got a tough thing to try to police that marriage. But think about the name Heracles. Hercules. What's the first part of his name? Hera. The second part of his name, Kleos, is fame. He's famous on account of Hera because she persecuted him so much. Okay. So she can't stop these affairs, but she has a tendency to go after the offspring. And she's shown with the gesture of a bride pulling aside her veil. Demeter is one of his sisters. She's easy to remember what she's in charge of: grain, cereal, ceres. Wheat mother, her name may mean that. And she's connected with a very powerful religion that basically tells you if you get initiated, you won't go to the afterlife as a gray shade. You'll have a glorious, wonderful life, but you have to be initiated. And she is the mother of Persephone, who's married to Hades. There she is. This is actually the Roman Empress Livia as Demeter, but there's her cornucopia, and what she's holding in her hand is grain. Aphrodite, sexual love. In some of her sanctuaries in the Greek world, she is worshipped through prostitution. And you might say, how is this possible? Well, how shall I put it? The men are contributing an offering when they engage with the prostitute. They are giving some of their sexuality, shall we say. This is an offering, okay? We will talk a little bit more about, if I heard that. We're going to talk about her birth. This is an image of her. She's most often shown with no clothes on of all the female goddesses because, hey, she's the goddess of sex. She's not just the goddess of, love. I love you too. No, she's the goddess of passion and sex and all of that. Then Artemis, the huntress. Artemis is, with Hestia, one of the virgin goddesses. These are goddesses who remain virgins, and Artemis particularly protects her virginity. Okay? She likes to run through the woods hunting things. She's kind of contradictory because she protects women when they're young. She also protects small animals while hunting. And you might say, how is that possible? But think about it. Conservation, right? If you don't have small animals that are protected, you won't have anything to kill later. Okay, so that's what she does. And she is the virgin goddess of childbirth. How is this possible? Well, when her mother gives birth to her and then her twin brother Apollo, her mother needs help. So she's born first and she helps her mother give birth to Apollo. Then you say, but she's a baby. Don't worry about it. This is it. I mean, logic doesn't always play a role in these stories. She's worshipped in the Greek mainland, and also there are Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor, in particular Ephesus, where this very unusual image of her is worshipped. Now, she's a virgin goddess. What are those things? People say they must be breasts, but they have no nipples. So, what are they? The latest theory is they are, in fact, bull testicles. The original wooden cult statue, when it was worshipped, would have been draped with bull testicles as part of an offering if a bull was killed. Then we have Athena. She's another virgin goddess. And we'll talk about her very unusual birth next time. She's a warrior goddess, but not a fighting in the sense of, leading troops into battle. She's the goddess of what we might describe as the good part of war, strategy, right? Like she's behind the Trojan horse idea. She's behind all the thinking part of war. Ares is all the blind killing, stumbling around, suffering. She's the, okay, this is what we're going to do. We have a plan. She's often called Glaucopes. What does that mean? Owl-eyed. She has beautiful eyes. I forgot to mention Hera is often called cow-eyed, and you might think, I'm not going to tell my beloved that my beloved is cow-eyed. But have you ever looked at the eyes of cows? They have beautiful eyes. So it's that Hera has big, beautiful brown eyes, and Athena has flashing eyes like an owl. She's in charge of things that women and men do. Weaving is women, carpentry is men, but technical skills. She's often described as a muscular virgin. She's not into frills. She's a serious person. Now, I want to end with this. We've been looking, that was the background, and we've been talking about where these myths may have come from, the writers that influenced them, and then we looked at the pantheon of gods. And so in some ways we often feel maybe we're connected to the Greeks, and there are some ways in which we share similar experiences with ancient Greeks. This is the inside of a Greek drinking cup. And what do you see? This is something that may be familiar to all of us at some point in our lives. But basically, this is a young man who's had too much to drink. He's throwing up, and this girl is holding his head. Now, I'm not saying we've all shared this experience, but this is an experience that some of us may have some familiarity with. So we feel a connection to the Greeks, and it's inside a drinking cup too. So when you finish drinking, this is what you see to remind you. But on the other hand, this is a group of people that are different from us. So we will see when we learn some of the things next time that while we have some similarities with them, there are also some other things that we might think, wow, is that how they looked at things? Okay, well, any questions?
Questions? Silence.
Silence.
Any questions from our Zoom audience?
Oh, we got.
Oh, okay.
I mistakenly or not have assumed for a long time that the Greek influence, or perhaps the Greek mythology, was sort of the standard throughout many centuries in that part of the world. So if you wanted to create a mythology, it had to be at least as good as the Greek mythology to be believable at all.
Yeah.
How wrong was I, or have I been?
You think about it, the Romans certainly didn't want to reinvent the wheel, right? They said, ooh, this is good enough for us. And they had their own stories about Roman kings and things, but for the most part, they went with the Greek gods and goddesses. And certainly classical civilization's been the foundation of Western education for a long, long time. And you see the influence of these myths in art, you see the influence of these myths in literature, certainly. So it's kind of the gold standard for Western mythology.
I understand that some scholars consider Roman culture to be a Hellenistic culture. Would you agree with that?
Roman culture is a lot of different strands of things. I mean, the Romans can see something and adapt it to their own point of view. So I wouldn't say that they certainly were heavily influenced by the Hellenistic world, but they had their own ideas about things. And what's fascinating about the Romans, see how they pick and choose different things and incorporate them into their own worldview.
After they basically took over Greece, they then had Greek teachers come and teach their children.
And they
so
loved Greek art too.
Seemed to be, yes, and that
all the art.
The Greeks worked in bronze statues. The Romans copied it in marble. So, okay, question, back of the room.
Nice presentation. Towards the middle, you spoke about the humans' approach and attitude towards the gods, worship, respect, and appeal. Hope they don't get them angry. Sounds like the basis of Christianity.
Well, certainly,
which has started at that time.
There's a lot of influence on Christianity from the older religions that are there, right? St. Paul goes to Ephesus to preach, and the Ephesians drown him out by screaming that this is the place of Artemis. So also there's, if you look at some of the worship of Dionysus, some of the descriptions are paralleled very much in descriptions in Christianity, worship involving blood, so yeah, this Mediterranean area, all these ideas are percolating in this area. And also when Christian writers, Christian preachers, when they want to explain things to people, they're going to use the terms and the things that people understand, right? And what do people understand? They're trying to convert people whose main religion is the Greek mythology religion, so they're going to use expressions and phrases and terms to try to help them understand what they're trying to say based on what people already understand.
More questions? Oh, thank you very much. Oh, one up here. Okay.
Oh, there's a
Alice Gridley says, thank you very much. Your touch made this fun. Sarah Galley says, will you spend time on Minoan civilization?
I can't spend any more time. We had to race through history faster than was humanly possible. But I don't think we're doing Theseus and the Minotaur in any more detail than what I did. So alas, no more Minoan.
No time.
No
Sorry.
time. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming, Zoom and in the auditorium.